Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to our audience from Asia. My name is Jianan Yang, and I'm a postdoc fellow at the Asia House Policy Program here at the Chirantan Asia Pacific Research Center. Welcome to our third PKU Stanford joint webinar on Asia House Policy this academic year. Before I introduce to you our speaker today, I would like to quickly note that our next webinar will be on February 2nd, 2023, and we will have Dr. Daniel Bennett from the University of Southern California talking to us about mental health issues in India. We will put out an announcement with more details about the event in January, and hope we could have you stay tuned for that. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to be updated about our Asia House Policy website. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Chirantan Chatterjee here talking to us about how the future might unravel for affordable access to new medicines. Dr. Chirantan Chatterjee is an applied macroeconomist and a reader in the economics of innovation at the University of Sussex. He's also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University, and a visiting faculty at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. His research interests are in the economics of innovation, pharmaceutical economics, and global health. And he's published in top peer-reviewed journals like Management Science, Red Journal of Economics, Journal of Development Economics, and Journal of Health Economics, among others. His new co-edited book on COVID-19 and grand challenges for health, innovation, and economy is forthcoming in 2023 with World Scientific. And Dr. Chatterjee has also consulted for the United Nations, World Bank, and the World Health Organization on COVID-19, universal health coverage, and incentives for medical innovation. The topic that Dr. Chatterjee will discuss today regarding the pharmaceutical access and innovations is such an important topic nowadays for countries around the world. And there are heated discussions on how to balance affordability and innovation incentives. And both of those are critical for the population well-being in the short run and in the long run. And I would like to especially thank Dr. Chatterjee for joining us here today at midnight local time because he's currently based in the UK. And we will therefore be a little more mindful about time today. And as usual, we will have Dr. Chatterjee talk to us for about 40 minutes. And for our audience, if you have any questions for our speaker during the talk, please enter them in the chat box and I will raise them either during the talk or at the end. And you can also raise your hand if you want to speak up directly and ask questions, and I can unmute you here. Without further ado, Dr. Chatterjee, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jianan. Let me just try to share my slides and then can get going. Indeed, it's a little late here from UK, and I'll try my best to stay awake. And Jianan, you have rightly captured that it's a question that is not only heated today, it was heated when I was starting my life as a PhD student. And somehow we as a society, even after being hit by a pandemic once in a century kind of a pandemic, haven't yet figured out how to solve this issue of finding new medicines that goes not just to a select few in the world, but for all, right? So that's basically what is the title that I'm providing here. Just before coming in, I was basically trying to spend some time looking at these couple of movies. One is this Hollywood movie, Constant Gardener, about this trial happening in Africa, where a big multinational company is doing all kinds of funky things to get a new drug approved. And also Dying to Survive, which is a Chinese movie about how a Chinese man gets imported cancer medicines from India, which is cheaper, and it's a comedy movie. So, but it was fun to like lighten up, to sometimes think that after all that we have seen in the last 3 years, and now with the war and with rising discussions around cost of living and the healthcare crisis in UK, there is a lot of discussions on the NHS and streamlining the NHS. Yet we seem to be not able to find how to focusedly attend to this question of new medicines for all, quality healthcare for all, which is essentially the trade-off that all societies are facing, rich and poor. Let's start with some recent events. Um, uh, Basically, I'll show you three screenshots. One screenshot is the story of how, let's say, the mRNA vaccines are going to be available to the elite in China, the expats in China. And we know that China is finally now relaxing the zero COVID situation there. We also know that mRNA technology vaccines hasn't really reached African patients, right? Now we are we are seeing the world making very slow progress in creating local capacity with Afrigen and other participants in creating these mRNA vaccines. And then finally, you also see last week or the week before launch of yet another super expensive drug, which is Hemgenix. A single dose will be priced at $3.5 million. And you look at this, and I've been looking at these data points for the last, I would say, 6 years of my PhD and 12 years of my post-PhD life, which is last 18 years. And I've been wondering, like, how do you reconcile that at one end, a substantial chunk of the globe is not getting access to what they should be getting access to, like mRNA vaccines. And at the other end, we are constantly saying or having the, I would say the ability to say that, or the innovative capability to constantly launch these niche drugs, super R&D complicated drugs that ultimately get priced at these obscene numbers that are that Hemgenix is coming with. It's the most expensive medicine. So I mean, at one end, I'm not going to be a moral ethicist around this, but you do wonder as an economist as to what is the moral underpinning under which we are operating these days when you are considering this question of new medicines for all. So, but more normatively, and rather than being positive about it, more positively rather than being normative about it, I do want to say, how can we accomplish new medicines for all? Do I have the answers? Probably not. My humble goal today is to build on some research that I have done in the last 12 years and built on a bunch of others who are looking at these questions from various universities around the world, to say that there are some answers out there, but there are still a lot of trade-offs that are being explored by policymakers, and we could see some new evidence on how to bring answer to this question, new medicines for all. Notice also that I'm not just talking about having some medicine, a generic medicine or a aphrodisiac or a traditional medicine. I'm emphasizing on having new medicines, and I'm positioning this as it's like clean air or education. If everybody is talking about having clean air for all, COP27 and all that, or education for all, why shouldn't we also talking about medicines and healthcare for everybody, right? Worldwide, there is also with COVID, this conversation around the need for entering into public expenditure for healthcare. But the interesting data point here, and I will just touch on this a little bit because I don't have too much time to deliberate on it. But if you look at the trend lines of the last 20 years, let's say we stop the data point around 2018-19 and look at the OECD nations, you will see that pharmaceutical expenditures is about 15 to 20% increasing over time. There is some variation between, let's say, a Japan to a China to a US, but that's roughly the percentage around which pharmaceutical expenditure is as a share of overall healthcare expenditure. But at the same time, as far if you step back from that data point and think about its substitutability or complementarity with public health expenditure, you'll start pondering that there are some distorted incentives at play here, in the sense that if a ideal nation starts allocating more on public health expenditure, potentially the prevalence of diseases will increase in the long run, requiring lesser interventions through medicines. So there is a little bit of a crowding out effect with increased public health expenditure that can be ushered in. And in some ways, that's something to keep in mind, especially with what has been happening with COVID and the macroeconomic stresses all around. More broadly, if we try to forget that COVID happened at all, and the conversations around relaxing the patents around mRNA vaccines or other medicines that are coming out, more broadly, the question has always been posited as a trade-off question, access versus innovation. And my goal has been, through small little projects, over the last 12 odd years to see if we can do a little better than making it as a trade-off. Can we do a little bit of access and do a little bit of innovation as well? So making it an access and innovation question. I do see a Q&A, Janan, if this is something important. Okay, we'll come to it a bit later on. So what do I find in my research? And I want to emphasize our research because there's a large bunch of collaborators I've worked with across the world over time with some very interesting data sets. And I'm very much indebted for being able to forge those collaborations. Broadly speaking, let me say that one of the first things that we started our story, our investigations on, was a very novel policy measure that comes from 1984 in the US, which is the Hatch-Waxman Act. Today, the Biden administration is talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and controlling insulin prices and thinking about carve-outs, etc. And just before Inflation Reduction Act, there was this conversation around bringing in generics for biological drugs through 2011 BCPIA drug policy reform. But the early precursor of all this was basically the Hatch-Waxman Act, and it was a novel policy instrument. I am not aware of such a curiously designed policy instrument anywhere else in the world that is able to, at one end, allow for generic entry, but at another end, also offer incentives for innovation for the innovating pharmaceutical company. So we use, in my dissertation, I use that act to show that in the short run, there is actually accelerated entry through a particular mechanism that the act provisions for, and it causes welfare gains. But we also see in a follow-on paper, and this is just recently accepted and is coming out next year, which is that generics penetration today essentially negatively impacts early stage pharmaceutical, ESP, early stage pharmaceutical innovation tomorrow. All right. So what basically these two papers provide is that even if you have experimental and creative policymaking, like as Hatch-Waxman Act demonstrated, the bottom line is that the solutions to market and government failures might need dynamic updating, because these efficiencies have these trade-offs that Jianan mentioned in the beginning of short-run welfare gains at the cost of potential long-run welfare losses. In fact, there's a fascinating paper that I don't think ever got published, but it was called Napsterizing Pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals constantly keep going through this Napsterizing effect, it seems. And these are the two sets of papers that showcase and find evidence using this novel policy setting in the US. Now, that was the US data, but as we were doing that study, we also started realizing that generic pharmaceutical firms, a bunch of them were coming from India, and India was also changing in the way the industry was evolving, because it signed the WTO Patents Act, the TRIPS Act in 2005, and implemented stronger patents. And after that, there were a bunch of other things that happened, including big pharma acquisition of Indian generic companies. In some ways, the Indian regulator kept pushing back entry of innovating firms through the threat of compulsory licensing or through drug price controls. And there were international spillovers of these ideas of how to somewhat push back the potential detrimental welfare consequences of stronger patents, monopoly rights, etc., and higher prices of drugs through usage of drug price control. So countries like, for example, I told you about Dying to Survive in China, or Thailand and Brazil and South Africa, there's almost like a block of countries that emerged which tried to take a leaf out of India's policymaking and wanted to use these drug price controls as a buffering scheme through which they could somewhat negate the potential price rising consequences of stronger patents. But in India, my papers with my co-authors find that price regulation, in fact, was the perfect seeding ground of the classic Peltzman law. Now, some of you who may not be economists in the audience would love to know this story. So just Google up Peltzman law. But basically, this was Sam Peltzman from Chicago, who showed that when the seatbelt laws were brought in the US, what happened was it was supposed to actually reduce the mortality consequence and the accidental outcomes by wearing seat belts. But essentially, it actually increased the adverse outcomes with the population, because people thought that my proximate driver is actually wearing the seatbelt. I don't need to wear my seatbelt. And likewise, in equilibrium, essentially the population started not wearing enough amount of seatbelt despite the laws, and the hazards from these road accident actually increased despite having these laws. So in some sense, drug price controls has this flavor of Peltzman law. It was supposed to bring the prices of drugs that were supposed to go up with strong patents in India higher in control, but it has actually generated, and I'll show you how, adverse welfare consequences. So what has drug price regulation in India done, more broadly speaking? 3 sets of papers. I'll just start with the first one. This is a particular paper in the context of the acetaminophen market, which we call in India and many South Asian countries as paracetamol. It's also available in over-the-counter in the US. What happened essentially was, in anticipation of this price control happening in a particular dosage strength of acetaminophen, the entire market was repositioned into a new dosage strength of paracetamol. It's a very interesting thing which you anecdotally know if you are a doctor in India or a patient, that suppose you are getting prescribed paracetamol of 500 milligram strength, which was called Dolo 500. Slowly, as they learned, the industry learned more about this price regulation coming on this particular formulation, they slowly moved the market equilibrium towards Dolo 650, which is a 650 milligram paracetamol or acetaminophen, to avoid the brunt of price controls. And we are able to show this systematically with data from India in this particular paper. So there was strategic repositioning that was evidenced with price controls. And as a result, prices really didn't come down on an average, is what we try to show. A related story that comes out is in metformin, which is a go-to drug for treating oral anti-diabetes. We know that India is the diabetes capital of the world. In fact, diabetes has increased even more around the world with COVID-19. What was observed in India with metformin was, in anticipation of price controls coming, some large firms more than smaller companies were doing price coordination, so that if the regulator was taking data from the market, knowing what is the floor price when you're taking when you're pondering what should be the level of price cap controls installed, the already coordinating effect of large firms resulted in an artificially manufactured higher price equilibrium level from which the sample was being drawn by the regulator. As a result, they were able to move up the ceiling of the price for metformin higher than what would have been had there been no price coordination. So we were able to catch that empirically in this particular paper and show that, well, ultimately you wanted to reduce prices, but essentially you are working with distorted prices because of collusive activity of firms, and you are not really ending up in reducing prices. The last thing we do is not in pharma, but in a related sub-market, which is in medical stents. Here, the story is even more concerning, and this is what my cardiologist friends tell me, which is that when India started controlling the stent prices, and I know that Ginger Jane is doing some work on stents in China as well. And I should, and there's a large conversation happening with price controls in Chinese stents market as well. What has essentially happened with that is physicians have changed the treatment standard. And from my reading of the health outcome consequences of these stents versus the other treatment standards, the coronary artery bypass grafts procedures, it does look like this could have long-run welfare consequences in terms of health outcomes. So broadly speaking, price regulation in India has induced strategic behavior, price coordination, treatment standards change in medical stents, and are not going in the direction where they were intended to be. They were actually generating unintended consequences. And just like textbook economics 101 predicts, inefficiencies and dead weight loss for society. Okay, so that's what we find from price regulation series of studies in India. Now you start pondering then, well, Hatch-Waxman Act has its trade-offs, and you also have these issues with price regulation in India. Then who will actually take care of trying to bring in affordable and quality / new medicines to everybody, to the poor of the world? So there, then the question is about agency. right? Was the highest agency? Well, the policymaker has the highest agency, but maybe the next agency is the manufacturer, right? So are the farms pondering any actions here? Was the next series of studies that I wanted to show you today. So basically what we find is that there are some interesting case studies. There are socially responsible, socially minded farms like Merck, which differentially priced Januvia, oral anti-diabetic drug, when it launched in India. By doing that, it was able to somewhat also deter the threat of compulsory licensing around the patent that's protected Januvia. And we are able to show through formal demand estimation structurally that in comparison to alternatives that were there, the counterfactual situations, such an approach by Merck resulted in a welfare enhancement. We were also, by the way, this Merck approach is a rarity. In fact, a classic one is one that I was having a chat with one of my colleagues here in University of Sussex. The approaches that Pfizer has taken and AstraZeneca has taken for their two vaccines, right? I mean, if you were following what Dame Richardson was saying, the Oxford Vice Chancellor, the other day, she's going out from her role. She was talking about how AstraZeneca could have behaved monopolistically, but didn't. But Pfizer potentially, behaved an order of magnitude higher, et cetera, et cetera. So there are heterogeneous firms and heterogeneous socially responsible behavior that we observe continuously in the data. And that's something to be kept in mind while thinking about firm actions. And I should add that even within firm, there are CEO effects. As CEOs change, the responsibility, the social mindedness of firms also change. That's another conversation, but since we are chatting about it, I thought I should mention. The second study I wanted to highlight was this, I would say, a disruptive entry model by an Indian company called Mankind Pharmaceuticals. It basically entered like Walmart in the US. It entered in the non-metropolitan cities of India by having partnerships with channel partners, basically general physicians and not specialist doctors, and were able for a long period of time to sustain a first mover advantage through that approach in these non-big cities of India. But we also find later on concerns about quality of medicines, aspirations grow, internal migration between big cities and small cities, creating complications for Mankind's model, change of ownership from the father to the son of this particular company, and their strategic orientation changes in terms of their social mindedness as an objective function in the firm to a more business-minded, a profit-minded kind of an orientation. So all of these things do show up. But I do want to highlight that both from the global north, innovator companies like Merck still show social responsibility. And from the global south, generic companies like Mankind are also pondering about how to take medicines to the poorest. Interestingly, you don't see a Cipla or a Dr. Reddy's, which are basically big generic Indian manufacturers. At the point in time when Mankind entered these smaller cities, they were not really entering those smaller cities. They were actually thinking a little bit about willingness to pay differentials between big, richer India and poorer India, and were letting the poorer India be, which was being catered to by Mankind. So broadly, my takeaway from these two studies is there are caveats around the elasticity of the market. Would we observe the same story in more inelastic markets, like let's say depression drugs or in cancer drugs? I don't know. We'll have to go to the data and check. And I suspect we probably won't. And then there is this issue of sustainability of a Walmart-style disruptive bottom of the pyramid entry that is potentially a big question as well. 3 other studies, these are not published. These are like very, very recent papers getting cooked, being reviewed, etc. I'm particularly fond of the paper with Shengmao Cao, who is right now an assistant professor at Kellogg's, former Stanford PhD student. Basically, Shengmao and me find out that there is this interesting phenomena of fixed dose combinations in India. Now, the more health policy guys are worried that a lot of these fixed dose combinations are getting launched, taking advantage of the regulatory voids and the institutional fragilities in the local market. But we are able to show that in some context, the FDCs are actually welfare enhancing in India. And in fact, if you simulate the same strategy in the US context, there could be actually some nice positive welfare consequences. So there is another paper on pharmaceutical cocktails by colleagues in Cornell, I think Lucarelli and others. So we are the two papers were talking about this welfare consequences of bundling drugs as a potential way to get new medicines to the poor. There is also this paper on drug distribution and procurement, which I have in the Indian context, but Sheng Mao and Jianan both have in the Chinese drug procurement context, which is also an important point. I mean, in India as well, state by state, there are reforms that have happened in the way drugs can be reached out to the population. And the state has played an important role. So we exploit one in the state of West Bengal, but the first one that was started here was the state of Tamil Nadu. And we see that there are some nice, like reduced form welfare consequences of trying to take drugs through the public channels, though the caveat there is the quality of medicines issue when you are trying to do this with a public channel. And the last one is around beyond, let's say, the standard economic policy kind of interventions, which is around the question of stigma. I mean, even if you have drugs, many people don't consume some drugs because there's a stigma around consuming those drugs or discussing those diseases, right? So in the context of Asperger's syndrome, we are finding that celebrity destigmatization helps. There was a Bollywood movie which was released, and that shifted the demand curve out, and physicians were in our data showing a lot of responses in the way they were prescribing atypical antipsychotics in comparison to typical antipsychotics, and stigma effects are very, very, very profound, as we know also for COVID vaccines, etc. So broadly, it does seem like farm actions are going to be intertwined with some sort of a sociological explanation as well in trying to get a pathway in providing new medicines for all. Other related issues to consider, well, I'll just briefly touch on this. I'm very glad to hear that Dan Bennett is coming in February. I'm really fond of that paper that he has on MedPlus's entry, which is a private pharmaceutical retailing channel chain in India. He basically explores how when they enter, what happens to welfare and quality of drugs, and finds positive effects. And in fact, this is a very important problem. With my co-author Ajay in Erasmus, we have investigated how there are these cartels and collusive behavior in the way drugs are distributed. Today in India, if you go, a lot of these drugs are being distributed through e-pharmacies, and it's there's a lot of e-pharmacies. There would be, I guess, some industry rationalization that will happen. But ultimately, whether it really improves access and quality of medicines that are available to the population is not investigated question. So PhD students out there may want to actually explore this. Associatedly, the last 2 points is on this question of bad medicines. While we are pondering on getting new medicines for the poor, we are also ending up into the story of getting weak medicines for the poor. Especially because some substandard medicines are continuing to be sold in India, as we find in one of our study, even after they are getting banned or even exported beyond India. Some of you might be following what happened with the cough syrup exports in Africa from India, and it keeps happening. I mean, The Bottle of Lies is a blockbuster book by Catherine Eben, so that's something to also ponder about while thinking about new medicines for all as an overarching question. And physicians have an important agency in this. I mean, it's not just in prescribing irrational medicines, but also, let's say, in pushing out aggressively antibiotic prescriptions, for example, which we find in a recent paper. So, I mean, these are some of the places where I think a lot more research needs to come out from different country contexts to inform how you can balance this question of access and innovation in the overarching policy motivation of trying to get new medicines for all around the world. So summary to me of my research is that Hatch-Waxman type act was likely working but needs to be attended in a dynamic fashion. Price regulation in the way it has happened in India is probably not working. Firm actions are showing some potential through differential pricing and disruptive entry. Streamlining distribution of drugs either through digital means or through public provisioning of these drugs seem to be helping. Stigma issues, sociology of medicine cannot be ignored. And my colleagues here in the Brighton and Sussex Medical School, I was having a chat with the head of the department here the other day, and she was talking about non-health interventions in solving diseases. Why do we always need to fall back on medicines? Can we not have something else solve the problem? So a classic case is that of availability of footwear for a skin disease that shows up on the foot in African countries, because people walk long distances on rough roads, and there are certain genetic considerations under which they develop this swelling on the foot. Podoconiosis is the condition. So there's some work going on in making certain types of footwear available. And in that world, we probably don't even have to have a 3.5 million dollar price drug to solve this particular problem. Again, I mean, I know this is for a larger audience, but from a research perspective, I think there are some interesting questions to leave you guys pondering on. I would love to do more research on these ideas. So some of you might be following how after a long time, malaria now has a vaccine, and the model through which the vaccine has been arrived at is a not for profit kind of a model, a social model where PATH and GSK and I think Gates Foundation have come together. So this Mosquirix experiment is worth pondering in terms of a broader scalability and sustainability point of view across therapeutic markets. We also know that a bunch of these poorer economies are now going to transition into a post-WTO TRIPS environment. So the least developed countries, will they learn from what India has achieved and not achieved? Or let's say what China has gone through while trying to control price of drugs? That's an important question to think about going forward. A third thing is this idea that we are all talking about inflation and rising cost of living, but nobody seems to be caring how much are we spending either on insurance by moving into a private insurance or out of pocket in these times when the cost of living is rising. So there's a classic paper on cephalosporin drugs, which does a price index computation. And I have been thinking about who is going to do the next global pharmaceutical price index, because even if you have like 5 years, 10 years of data and by markets and countries, I think there's some very interesting stuff to be done there. Though I admit, I concede that pricing regimes are different in different parts of the world, and that has to be considered while doing this kind of an index calculation. I also think that relatedly, the interlinkage between the environment and health, I don't put it up here, but environment and health, the fact that the worldwide there would be heat stresses, large parts of the world are having temperature rises, it would completely change the way innovative activity in pharmaceutical companies are happening and the nature of diseases tomorrow. And that has to be studied more carefully at the intersection of not just asthmatic conditions or inhalers when pollution strikes cities like Delhi, but more broadly speaking, how is the portfolio of innovation changing for biopharmaceutical innovation? That's what digging into for those who have a taste for that kind of a question. And evidence needs to come definitely from beyond US, UK, Europe, and India. And I'm glad papers are coming out with data from China these days. And relatedly, like there are e-pharmacy papers. I know Manuel and others in Hopkins are working on this. So yeah, so these are some of the open questions. A last one is on how do you build innovative capacity for neglected diseases, neglected diseases, R&D. And Anita McGahan and some others have actually pondered on this question, especially in the context of antibiotics, who will get the next big antibiotics. So it would be nice to see what are the incentive story there, what are the heterogeneities in innovative activity, etc. That are some open questions. Lastly, I mean, there's always a lastly with me. I am also seeing in some, I would say, early stage project, these effects of how AI is being adopted in biopharmaceutical innovation. And mRNA is spilling over more broadly in the way R&D is being done. So will this ultimately lead to cheaper and newer medicines, I will keep an eye out on that for the next paper or what the data is telling me essentially. So if there will be some R&D efficiencies that can reduce the cost of doing a new drug, which is supposedly around $2 billion today, to an order of magnitude lower using the capabilities from the mRNA platform or from artificial intelligence, that's something potentially going to help in getting new medicines for all, ultimately going forward. So I would like to end with what Dr. King said a long time back. And I hope that for those who are attending this talk, this was illustrative and useful enough. Full acknowledgements to my collaborators and everyone else who is working on this very important question. I'm over, Gianna.
Thanks, Chirantan, for sharing your research with us. And I feel like it's amazing to hear your thoughts on like so many aspects of the pharmaceutical industry. And it's also fascinating to see how your research agenda revolves around this central issue, but touched on many different aspects. So I know like due to the time constraints for a lot of the topics, we don't have enough time to elaborate on that. So if there's some interest from the audience want to hear like Dr. Chatterjee discuss like any, I think, one of his specific work, please like feel free to ask in the chat box or raise your hand. So let's start with the question that we have now in the chat box, right? Like you can see it. Do we feel that the pricing medicines so high will impact the ESG aspect of the companies negatively? And you've spoken a bit about the pro-socialness, I think, right?
I don't know. It's a hypothesis worth testing. I mean, it's funny you ask me this because this morning I had a database demo of Refinitiv, which is basically collecting lot of ESG data by firms by year and quarters on various dimensions of ESG activity. Now that you ask me this question, I probably have to go back and check whether when firms launch these very high priced drugs, does that flow back into the ESG measures? My general sense is it may not, but who knows? I mean, firms are heterogeneous, more social responsibility considerations may have set in recent times, and we were able to pick up something in the data. So that's a good question.
Yeah, I just want to briefly follow up on that because like when we think about the ESG or you also mentioned the companies' pro-socialness in like how much they decide to take on social responsibility when pricing and distributing medicines. That I think probably those kind of like big pharmaceutical companies are more likely to take on those kind of social responsibility, right? But like how do we think about, especially in developing countries, the role of the smaller companies and in general?
That's precisely where attempts like Mankind Pharmaceuticals catches your eye, where from the beginning itself they say stakeholders, not shareholders, is our orientation. But peer firms are not doing it. The Ciplas of the world are not doing it from the beginning itself. They are caring for the shareholders in some sense. So I think it boils down to the individual running. You need the Sam Waltons of the world in some sense in pharma, whether it's in India or in China or wherever. So that's basically the point I'm trying to make. I see a couple of raised hands, Shannon. Howdy.
Right. Yeah, I think Lisa, I guess I need your help in bring them to the panelists. I don't think I can do that from my end.
Or maybe you can Howdy Wang and Yang Mu Huang. Maybe you can put in your questions in the
right before
Q&A.
we were able to unmute you. Yeah, but there's one question I think from the Q&A. Probably we can briefly address that one first.
Sure.
While we resolve that issue.
Yes, I do have some thoughts. So how Linda is asking, how can artificial intelligence do that? I think the place where artificial intelligence is making inroads in the pharmaceutical innovation process is in streamlining the inefficiencies in paperwork in clinical trials data. I mean, especially as you go from small trials to large trials. And a few companies are early movers in this space. Other companies are going through their own cultural pushbacks. They don't want to overhaul their scientific teams, etc., etc. And the regulator also has to be attended to as well. But a PhD student of mine is actually investigating what artificial intelligence is, where artificial intelligence is basically making inroads in pharmaceutical patenting data, and is finding some positive signals there, especially, as I said, in the clinical trials type of patenting. The other part to note here is that it's happening especially for those companies who seem to be already doing some AI type of work um, before these inroads are happening. So there is some learning that they were preparing to absorb AI into their innovation process. Now, how will this help? So I told you about this $2 billion on an average taken for a new drug to launch in the market. This is the estimate from Dimasi et al. 2016. Basically, 1/3 of that is from clinical trials. 30% of those, that entire number is, they say, coming from clinical trial cost. So if there is a way we can reduce the amount of costs expended on clinical trials through artificial intelligence, I think that's a very cool place to start with, in how AI can ultimately reduce that number, and which will trickle down downstream in lesser prices of medicines. The other place where I know a lot of activity is happening is around drug repurposing, where machine learning and artificial intelligence is helping in getting into large drug libraries and trying to find out new uses of old drugs. So the Broad Institute at MIT is doing a lot of work here. And I know that a bunch of folks in the London ecosystem are also trying this out. There are non-pharma, like Google DeepMind has a spun out unit which is trying to get into this space, etc., etc. So I think that's another area where I would expect through which there could be some efficiencies generated in the cost of R&D. So yeah, though that's how it might actually result in better and cheaper medicines.
Yeah, I think like we are increasingly seeing that the AI technology is playing an increasingly important role in all aspects of healthcare. I think like people have explored the AI technology in like diagnosis, right? And let's keep an eye up for that. I think that really has some potential of like changing the future of healthcare, of medicine. And so now we've bring Hao and Yang Mu to the panelists. So I think Hao, you're the first. You want to unmute yourself and ask? Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you for sharing, Dr. Chirantan, and it is a very interesting and rich for sharing for today. So I have learned a lot from your talk about India's situation and the regulation of the price. So my question is more related with the health economics and the use of health technology assessment in the negotiation of price, because we know that in both UK and China, the government has launched the national negotiation with pharmaceutical companies for lowering the price in the national reimbursement drug list. So it could save money for the bureaucracy or the administrations. So my question is that, do you think that this is a good way to repricing the innovative drugs with the health technology assessment evidence, or do you think that pharmaceutical company may choose different strategies to, for example, choose not to be reimbursed in the market in the future?
I mean, I haven't done any study on this, so I will have to be cautious in what I say here, but it's a question that has been lurking on my mind, because if you look at US, the environment is a free market environment. I mean, at least till very recently, prices are more broadly left to the market forces. In contrast, if you see at what is happening in the UK or has happened in the UK, prices are negotiated, and a large part of Western Europe, it's reference price based. And the underpinning of this is basically HTA. So it seems like it has been working. And that is the trend in China and India. You are right. From what I'm hearing from policymakers and industry colleagues, that seems to be what is happening. Whether that's a better one versus a world where you keep it all to the market forces, I think we'll have to wait to see. I feel some incentives are given back to the firms by taking an HTA approach, which is better to them in contrast to a completely like autocratic price regulation type of an approach, which is why it's somewhat Pareto optimal for both the pharmaceutical firm as well as for the social planner to take a HTA route. But I'm also concerned that the capacity and the transparency with which this HTA route is informing pricing of drugs is not up to the market, let's put it that way. So in some sense, there would be some lobbying perhaps tossed into the HTA models that are going to be used to price the drugs. Governments will learn their mistakes, and then they will probably update their rosters on prices of drugs, etc., etc. So my sense is it's probably better than a price regulating kind of an environment where they, as my research is showing, there are some pretty bizarre unintended consequences. But is it like really working awesome? We'll have to like get into the data and check. It's a cool question to get into the data and check. Let's say for the same drug market, which was in the regimen before without HTA and then post HTA, what is happening to the diffusion of drugs? What does it do to health outcomes, etc., etc. I think that's worth quite studying a lot.
Right.
And I should also add, if you look at the launch time of a new drug, it always gets launched first in North American markets and with a little bit of a lag in OECD and then India and China and rest of the world, right? I mean, Coburn and his co-authors have a paper on how price controls, patents, and willingness to pay. These troika essentially affect the launch timing of drugs. So potentially HTA will compress the lag in launch timing of drugs is my sense of it. And there would be associated things that I think the regulator will need to do, which is a quid pro quo stuck with the industry. Like one of the questions in the Q&A window says that in the most recent revision of drug price regulation in India, in the essential medicine list, they've kept out some expensive antibiotics and cancer drugs. So it feels like it's a quid pro quo that has been struck with industry and social planner to restore back some incentives for innovation in a world where you are not getting the relevant drug that is required, and you have to like send the patient outside of India or China to get those drugs, or resort to parallel importing like Dying to Survive was showing, right? So that's my sense of what the direction would be with HTA.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for awesome. So yeah.
So Yang Mu, you wanna unmute yourself and ask questions?
Thank you, Chirantan. I think it's a very inspiring speech. I'm actually from the School of Public Health, Peking University, and a joint researcher for the School of Global Health and Development, Peking University. I've been doing some similar research on R&D and public health for the past 10 years, mainly focusing on infectious diseases or NTDs and how to improve the research and development, including access to the vulnerable population. So when you talk about such as antibiotics or NTDs or a lot of different diseases or products, I have one thought that if we think about these products that are hoping to be public goods for the future or for a more access to all the population. International collaboration might be very important, but research and development and access is a very long process. When do you think is the right timing, or when is, or the best roadmap for international collaboration. For example, at the very basic research time, should we include or improve or accelerate international collaboration, or whether it is more possible during the clinical trial stage when, especially for some emerging infectious diseases or NTDs, the really research country might not have enough cases for clinical trials, or if you think it's more possible at the market stage, because I've actually went to Texas before. It's really beautiful campus, and we have been collaborating with your colleagues as a UK-China program for how to improve international collaboration for the R&D of antibiotics. So I've been always thinking about this question because sometimes because of the IP problems or a lot of challenges, collaborations, international collaborations at the very beginning of the research stage is quite challenging. So I was really hoping to hear your thought about when is the proper timing, or how do we improve international collaboration during this long process, and to make it more feasible, or to accelerate the whole R&D and access process for the whole population. Thank you very much.
Great question, Yang Mo. I think let me just try to take you back to this question. I mean, answer this question by saying that in general, innovation, and since I'm a faculty in economics of innovation, the successful launch of innovation is predicated not just from strength in technology, but also from strength in complementary assets, they say in the literature. So there's this classic 1986 paper by David Teese, which shows the role of both technology as well as complementary assets. Complementary assets as in the ability to do, let's say, clinical trials, take drugs to commercialization, do post-drug launches, take it, scale it globally, etc., etc. So you probably will get into some sort of a 2x2 in that context, where certain drug markets are highly complex in terms of the underlying science and low complex in terms of the underlying science, and then require high attention on complementary assets and low attention on complementary assets. So broadly speaking, if you then see there are these four spaces in that 2x2 kind of a situation, where the more complex type of drug markets with high attention needed on complementary assets will probably require international collaborations from the beginning itself, versus a drug which is working with a lower technological complexity but higher, let's say, commercializability and complementary assets. They may require a little later, after a proof of concept is generated and some initial trials data is generated. And you exactly see this happening, especially if you're talking to startups in India. So way back when I was a faculty member in Bangalore, so before coming to Sussex, I was in India for about 11 years, and I started my post-PhD life in the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and I was writing a case study on a company called Connexious Life Sciences. I don't even know if they exist today or not. I think they sold out their product, the molecule, to Boehringer Ingelheim about 5th or 6th year in their journey. But they were basically trying to do a new oral anti-diabetic molecule. And they essentially went into international collaboration, having done all the initial small trials, the science, the investigational new drug application, etc., much later, like 5 or 6 years after doing all the science, sitting in Bangalore. So in that world, I think the takeaway I get is oral antidiabetics is probably a far less complex disease than, let's say, cancer today or the central nervous system drugs, which is why they didn't need to have a scientific partner in international collaboration. However, I know of another company, for example, if you look at, I don't know, pick up a, there's a company called Bugworks, which is again in Bangalore, a startup company, which is apparently having a new antibiotic in its kitty through the R&D process. And it is actually trying to get marketing partners very quickly, so that it can scale it for the world. So, I mean, my basic point is that the underlying technological complexity of the drug, along with the need for how you are going to launch the drug, how you are going to take the literature around the drug's efficacy to the doctors, these sophisticatedness or the lack of sophisticatedness that might be required around a drug will decide the timing of when you want international partners with you as you try to take neglected diseases or new antibiotics to the market. Part of it is also that sometimes knowledge, it's so what we just talked about when you talked about international partners, it's like explicit in international partnerships, but sometimes knowledge gets transmitted also through individuals. So you might have a founder running a company who actually has training in, let's say, innovator company in the US, has identified some novel target, but that was not being pursued in that innovator company, but goes back to the home country and starts a startup. So in some sense, that's also international partnership, but the knowledge transmission is tacit. It's not explicit, right? And I knew actually, now that we are talking both to a Chinese audience and there are some Indians also, it seems, I knew of an Indo-Chinese couple who was working in National Chemical Laboratories in Pune, India. So both of them were working in Lilly in US, and they went back and started this proteomics startup, Shantani Proteomics. And I don't know what's their future today, but they both had a PhD from UIUC or something like that, a US place. But basically that's an example of partnerships as well. So my sense is partnerships can come in varied form. The timing of it will probably be guided by the scientific and the commercial complexity of the product. And you have to basically do your own judgment depending on these complexity dimensions to make a decision on the timing of partnerships. I hope that helps, Yango.
Yep, thank you very much. And actually, we're trying to do some comparison studies between China and India and see how, South-South collaboration. So it's really very pleasure to hear your talk, and hope in the future we could have some more discussions. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the pharmaceutical markets, the industries in China and India actually share a lot in common. So I don't see, I think, like there are further questions from the audience. Yeah, I do see one. Right, so Lisa, can you help again? Bring G2 to the panelist. So while we wait for that, I can probably quickly ask the question that I have.
Sure.
Yeah, so basically I was thinking, yeah, G2 was here. Let's have G2 go first.
Yeah. Hi, Janan. Hi, Chirantan sir. So my question is around the generic, as you said, and we know that today in US, if we see in terms of the market, more than 90% of the prescription are generics, where the whole concept of generic is like reducing the therapy or the treatment cost by reducing the cost of the drug, because that's what we see in the generic market. When a generic launches, almost there is an erosion of 80 to 90% of market. And if innovator is not doing a power play and not launching a innovator's generic, in that scenario, the numbers, what comes out from the economical spending is what is not complementing. If you see, it's like a negative innovation which is happening, and the expenses going out of pocket apart from the copay models in US are still tremendous high. So what is your take on this, and what do you feel that where the Indian pharmaceutical generic companies do fit in this model? Do you think that the whole synergy or the transaction model need to be revolved around in US, or they should adopt something like a European model, because that is also very evolved system?
Yeah, so you should look at the work of Neeraj Sood at USC. He has a recent paper where he shows how insulin should ideally be low priced, but a large amount of this rents in the value chain is being captured by the intermediaries, which are called the PBMs in the US. And it's an antitrust issue as a result. So somebody I'm expecting from FTC or somewhere else in the regulatory ecosystem in US will pay attention to this finding and try to erase the frictions that are there in the value chain. Until they are not erased, I think there is a lot of rents being given up to these intermediaries by, let's say, generic drug companies from India. So the other thing that they are sometimes doing is also like price fixing, right? There is they have like a few Indian generic companies have been found to come together and do some price fixing by the regulator in the US as well. And mainly the reason for that is trying to find this small little pie in the market where you have this niche market share. But the reason you need that niche market share is because a large part of the rents in the system are actually going to these intermediaries. So yeah, I would say that US would need to somewhat reform this way of how drugs are meted out. And my sense is, I'm not the expert here. I know my colleagues here in Stanford, many of them are actually working with the Biden administration to rationalize these things. So one would expect those things to somewhat mitigate the loss in incentives for the generic firm trying to sell drugs, where a lot of these incentives and rents are actually being appropriated by intermediaries in the value chain in the US. In that world, my suggestion to Indian generic firms would be start thinking about exploration, start thinking about discovery. How long are you going to play the generic game? It has been 30 to 40 years. Let's put in some real big bets and do some moonshot exploration. I think that's basically my call to action here.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thanks, Jitu, for your question. And I also feel like the Indian Chinese pharmaceutical companies are like playing an increasingly important role in the whole innovation game, right? And like are becoming increasingly important in the global pharma like market. Yeah, so I think we are out of time, and I don't want to hold Dr. Chatterjee for too long because it's late. So thank you so much, Dr. Chatterjee, again for sharing your insights on this super important industry with us, and thank our audience for participating, and hope to in touch with you for future webinars.
Thank you
all
very
again.
much. Thank you everyone for your awesome questions. I loved it, and I wish you all the best and happy holidays and happy New Year.
Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye.